The MBA Candidate Podcast is the world's most exciting show about what it's like to go to business school. We cover all the action, from the GMAT to networking, all the way to case interviews and behavioral interviews. Welcome to the MBA Candidate Podcast, the show that interviews business school students about life. I'm your host, Adam Miller, a first-year MBA candidate at the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business. On today's episode, we have Chris Clark, who's headed to the GSB at Stanford. Welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Adam. Thanks for having me.
I want to start off with growing up in Kansas.
Most of my family's from Kansas in the Oklahoma City area. My mom went to Wichita State University, and that's where most of the people in my high school went to. I went to a public school called East High School. All those high schools in our city were named after directions. And so it was very unusual to go to Dartmouth, but I think my mom studied journalism at Wichita State and wasn't able to leverage that degree into making a good amount of money. And so I think because of that, one of the things that she sort of impressed upon my sister and I was going to just any college wasn't necessarily the key to success. And I think a lot of people just sort of view growing up that if you get into college, then you've already made it. And we sort of realized that that was sort of one step and that there was a lot more that needed to go into that afterwards.
Sounds like you knew that you wanted to get a job that would make you financially secure. What professions were you aware of then that you were hoping to explore?
I didn't really know what a business person did. I only knew what doctors did from, Grey's Anatomy and, lawyers from TV and stuff like that. When I was applying to college, I hadn't even put together that people actually worked in tech and that there's a company behind, Google or Facebook. And so for me, I thought about being a lawyer because I had done debate in high school. And, you just think that debate is closely tied to law. And the secondary job that I had thought about was investment banking. And I don't remember how I had come up with that, but my only interest in investment banking was that I knew that they made a lot of money. And I thought that that was a way to sort of raise my own socioeconomic status and sort of take advantage of, going to a school like Dartmouth.
Well, you've had many stints now in tech. Does that mean that you had to learn to code while you were at Dartmouth?
No. So what happened was once I got to Dartmouth, I was taking some public policy courses, thinking about law. And I also took some econ classes thinking about banking. But what happened was I was in a club my freshman year, the Dartmouth Afro-American Society. The vice president at the time was a class of 11 person named Jana Landon. And she had recently accepted an offer to go to Google and be in people operations. And she was the one who told me about working at Google, also referred me to this Google Bold Immersion program, which was like a 5-day camp to really learn about the tech industry at the Mountain View headquarters. You do a case study, and if you did well, it would convert into sort of an interview process to get an internship the following year. And so that was really how I learned about tech. And I learned that not only that there were jobs there, but that there were jobs that didn't require any type of coding or sort of a technical background, but that there were all these jobs in sales, account management, and marketing, and business and finance that you could be a part of as well.
Wow. So did you get the internship at Google that next summer?
Yeah, I did 2 internships at Google. The first one was after my sophomore year. I was basically a sales analytics intern. Have you heard about retargeting ad campaigns?
No, I'm not familiar.
Let's say I go on AmericanApparel.com and it'll track that I went there using cookies, and then I'll go to some other web page and I'll see an ad for American Apparel.
Ah, so that's you.
Yeah, so that was, at the time, that was a very new and experimental ad format. Now it's incredibly, popular. Basically, my internship was running tests for these large businesses to show them that that was an effective ad campaign. And then the second summer, I joined the YouTube Next Lab team, which basically advises businesses on how they can bring more engaging content to the YouTube platform, like having intro video or posting on a regular cadence so that you can build an audience that way.
Dude, that is amazing. Why did you ever leave those 2 organizations?
No, so I really enjoyed both internships, and I thought it was a great opportunity. But the YouTube Next Lab team was actually acquired by Google, and they had been a startup. And so they worked in a different office. They kind of encouraged me to go join a startup because at big companies, one of the things that you learn, at least in the tech industry, is the bigger the company, the more specialized the roles go, and the more more sort of narrow focus of responsibility you get at a younger, more junior age.
What did you do full time after you graduated? What were those startups that you pursued?
So the first one was a company called Symphony Commerce. Symphony Commerce was an e-commerce as a service platform. It was recently acquired, actually. And basically what it did is it said, let's say you make tables, for example. You're probably really good at picking out, what kind of wood to go into the table and how you design and sort of manufacture it. But you might have trouble building an e-commerce store or dealing with fraud. We'll handle all that stuff for you. Let you focus on your product and brand. And in return, we'll take a sort of a revenue share of the sales that we get.
That makes total sense. And what was your role specifically?
So I was the fourth sales hire. And so we did a little bit of everything from sourcing and closing deals to building marketing collateral, working on demo websites. But essentially, one of the big things that you do at a startup, particularly in B2B or business to business, either building the product or getting customers to see the product. And so it was a lot of just writing cold emails to people or, trying to network with people, because when you're a startup, one of the biggest problems is nobody has heard of your product before or your company, and you don't have any references to give to people to make them feel comfortable trusting you, even if they don't know you. And so it's really hard to just get them to hear you out. That's a lot of what you work on, is just how do you get people to take the time to hear you out that you could possibly solve their problem.
So you sent out those really fancy emails that take 10 seconds to load and then it goes right into my spam folder?
Yeah, it was a lot of just sending out emails. And another big thing that we actually thought a lot about in the early days, which I had never realized, because at a lot of companies, you don't ever think about this in sales. How do you find customers who would fit this need? Like mid-sized companies that have a good product that could scale, but are probably struggling with these sort of logistical back-end issues that we could help them with. We would go to big websites that would have multiple brands on it, like Sephora has a lot of brands on it. Amazon had a lot of brands on it. Take those company names, look up who would be a decision maker there, and then just sort of reach out to them. It taught me, how to deal with rejection. And then I think the other thing that was super valuable about that experience is that it taught me how to write emails and be sort of proactive in outreach.
How to write emails. What does that mean? I feel like I know how to write an email.
I realized that by focusing on brevity and sort of a clear call to action, I was able to get the highest response rates. Always making sure that was 3 sentences max and that was very short. One of the practices I would do to sort of make sure that was short enough is I would send the email to myself and then I would look at it on my phone. If the phone could lay out basically the entire email in one screen, then I knew it was short enough. But if you had to scroll to read more of the email, I said that was too long. Then I would go cut it down again.
Do you do that in your personal life as well? And how did that suit you for writing really long essays for business school?
So it definitely helps in my personal life. One of the things that I started doing shortly after I joined that startup is I would start to send emails, not just to businesses during work time, but I would also do that to other people within the industry as a way to network. And so I was able to meet some really interesting people. I remember I tweeted at Mark Andreessen and I got him to talk to me. I was able to talk to this really senior guy at Yahoo and the head of business development at Uber at the time. It was basically just me finding interesting people on LinkedIn who I was interested in their career. And then I would just send them cold emails in a similar style that was very short and to the point. And a lot of times they would take the time and just, maybe talk to me for 30 minutes. And most recently, I had an internship this summer at Disney before I started Stanford. And I got that from, sending a cold email to the chief strategy officer at Disney.
So you're saying when I want to get an internship next year, I should just email the CEOs of all the companies I want to work at with 3 sentences?
I wouldn't necessarily say the CEO is the right person. I think you have to be really focused on who exactly would be the correct person to email. So, for example, I emailed the chief strategy officer at Disney because, have you heard of Recode before?
No, I haven't heard of that.
It's basically a tech news website started by this woman named Kara Swisher. And it focuses mainly on tech and media. And they have a number of conferences throughout the year focused on different topics. And one of those conferences was called Recode Media. And the chief strategy officer at Disney actually spoke at it about their new streaming service. And I had been really interested in what they were doing in streaming since they announced that they were going to make that shift to their business and thought it was a really cool opportunity in tech. And so when I saw that interview and I saw him talking about it, then I knew that he was the right person to reach out to.
What was the subject line and what were you saying saying?
The subject line was, "How can I work for you?" And the content was, "Hi, Kevin. I admire your career at Disney. I think Disney's forthcoming play in streaming is one of the most exciting opportunities in tech. I have valuable tech experience and plan to get my MBA at Stanford in the fall. What could I do to get to work for you?"
That makes me think that the emails I've been sending to people to come on my podcast have been way, way too long. Luckily, I've met some people in person. And when I met you in person last week in New York, I want to ask you about something similar when it comes to executive presence. You told me that you don't own a suit. And every single other person at that conference who was an incoming MBA student was wearing a suit on multiple days.
Well, I wasn't necessarily not wearing a suit to make a statement. It was more so, as I mentioned earlier, I started interning at Google when I was 20, and then right out of school, I worked at a startup. And so there was just never a need for me to ever wear a suit because I always worked in environments where it was casual. I just didn't own one. It was tough for me to make that kind of big investment on buying a suit for a 3-day conference.
Yeah, I know. I'm just giving you a hard time. I actually did a thing where at the company I worked at, I didn't own a suit either when I first started there 5 years ago. Got some feedback that I should go buy one. So I saved my money for the first 9-10 months, went out and bought 5 suits off the rack at Men's Warehouse, got them tailored. And then I only wore suits for the next 2 years, even on Fridays. And it was partly because I realized that that would kind of stand out for somebody who was like 23. And people would say, wow, like this guy must be really serious. Then a year and a half ago, I switched. I completely stopped wearing suits. I donated all of my clothes that were in between that were business casual to charity. And I only wore jeans and a company t-shirt because I had like 40 of them, 10 different varieties to everything I went to in my life. And now all I own is those 5 suits and a bunch of shirts from that company. So I've started stocking up on UVA Darden t-shirts. I want to hear a little bit more about some of the advice you've gotten in the Valley. I read Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and it was so fascinating to learn more about what it's like to be an entrepreneur or a CEO when things are not going well. Can you talk about some of the things you've learned doing all that networking around San Francisco?
Well, I remember I spoke to Chris Lyons, the chief of staff at Andreessen Horowitz one time. I just hit him up and he happened to end up responding. And one of the things that he gave me really good advice about was you shouldn't join a startup because you think it's a good sort of career move. You should only join the startup if you really, really think the startup is going to be successful and if you really, really believe in the core idea, because otherwise you're going to get frustrated and sort of the level of engagement and sort of passion that you're going to bring to the project isn't going to be enough for you to be successful in the first place. That was really great advice for me when I thought about my next role after Symphony Commerce, thinking about which companies was I really passionate about and did I really think had a really clear path to success so that I could deal with sort of all the ups and downs and changes that go on at startups.
To synthesize what you're saying, Chris, getting on a rocket ship, aka joining a startup that's growing super fast, is much more important than picking the perfect role in Silicon Valley. So I know you most recently spent 3 years at Twilio. What do they do?
Twilio is a communications API company. So basically, they provide a set of tools for developers to easily add communication channels. So Uber and Lyft, for example, use them to let you call your driver without giving out your personal phone number.
Oh, that makes sense. When I was arriving in New York for the MLT conference that we were both attending in Midtown Manhattan last week, I had my headphones in my lap, but I forgot them in my Uber when I stood up and I think they fell out. I tried calling my driver when I got up to my hotel room, but I got sent to this automated thing. I remember he was able to call me though when he was picking me up from LaGuardia. Does that have something to do with you guys at Twilio?
Yeah. So what's interesting about the way in which Uber works is they're essentially buying phone numbers in real time whenever a ride starts and then getting rid of them afterwards. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, from a cost perspective, it doesn't make sense for them to have a single phone number for every single driver. Like it's a sort of misuse of resources. And so one of the things that they do is they take a phone number, they use it for that ride, and then they sort of clean it, and then they use it for a different ride so that they can get the maximum utilization of the phone numbers that they own. And they can do that using Twilio programmatically. And then the second reason why is just for a safety reason. So one of the things you realize is that you don't really want every single person that you've ever been in a car with to have your phone number and be able to reach you at any time.
From the driver's perspective and from the standpoint of the passenger safety, that makes a ton of sense. That technology is really, really wonderful. I'm looking at Twilio's website right now, and it seems like your team has relationships with Yelp and Lyft and TaskRabbit, Instacart. These are all services that have to do with frequent interactions with complete strangers. And it says you guys also work with Airbnb. I love that because I'm headed back to Times Square next Friday for an internship interview, and I'm going to be staying at some random guy's house right nearby for less than $100, which is amazing. And I wouldn't want him to have my contact info forever, and I shouldn't be allowed to have his. Let's shift gears and talk about business school a little bit. Coming from the world of tech, what did your coworkers say when you told them you were going to be applying to business school? Or did you even tell them before you found out you got in?
I reached out to people, upwards of 50 people who I thought would be able to offer me a good perspective because they were more senior than me. So I would say most people who had a business school degree thought it was really valuable and said I should do it. And then most people who didn't have a business school degree said it was a waste of time. It wasn't really worthwhile. And so that wasn't super useful. I was at a product marketing manager role at the time. And one of the things you realize at that point, as a product marketing manager, you're responsible for sort of the launch of a new product. And it really isn't necessarily so much about the individual things that you do, but it's about getting design, getting sales, getting product to all come together and participate in the launch and sort of add in their piece. And the challenge is that none of those people in those different functional areas actually reported it to me. And so the only way I was able to get them to contribute their piece was with the indirect influence and how I was able to sort of relate with them. What was really a learning about Stanford and the GSB was that they sort of framed the entire program as being about developing your emotional intelligence. Everybody being about providing feedback on how you can get better, how you can be a better leader, and what your leadership style is and what your strengths and weaknesses are. Because I saw all three of those things as sort of a consistent theme of people I admired, and I saw that I could get that going through business school, I decided to apply.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into advice. What's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten?
So when I was younger, I think a great piece of advice I got was from my mom, who told me that you should never let anybody else tell you what you are and are not capable of. That's something that you have to decide for yourself. And that's not about blindly always thinking that you can do whatever, but it's about knowing that no other person has as much context into you as you yourself do. You know, if I asked you, Adam, whether or not you could start your own company, a lot of people might have opinions on whether or not you would be good at it or whether you would be not good at it. But the truth of the matter is that only you would know whether or not you would be able to start the company best, because you're the person who knows how motivated you are. You're the person who knows your strengths and weaknesses best. And you're the person who has the most at stake versus if you asked me, for example, and I gave you sort of a casual response, obviously I don't have to live with the consequences of the decision. I don't know you as well. And so my sort of advice and opinion shouldn't be held as valuable as your own personal opinion is what you want to do. I think that's really important because I see a lot of people who suffer from imposter syndrome or who just end up not shooting high enough because somebody told them that they couldn't do it or that it was going to be really tough or that recommended them turning against it. And I've always felt that a lot of my success comes from me trusting myself and my own decision making because I feel like I know myself more. And that's sort of what drove me to apply to Stanford and go to business school when, you know, not everybody told me it was a good idea. It drove me to apply to Dartmouth when my college counselor didn't think that was a good idea. It was what drove me to continue to take calculus when my math teacher said that wasn't a good idea. I think back to some of the advice I got. It literally could have ruined my life if I had trusted it. So I'm glad that I was able to remember that advice that I got from my mom about just trusting myself and being honest with what I can and cannot do.
Sounds like you really know yourself pretty well, Chris. In the long term, what do you see yourself doing?
Well, ultimately, I want to start my own company. The way I view my career right now is I have a lot of great experience in sales and marketing, and I'm about to go to business school and build a lot of foundational skills in business. Hopefully, post-business school, I'd like to get more experience working closer with a product.
Got it. So you see yourself definitely staying in tech, but what are some of the myths around the industry, and what are some of the actual downsides that you see?
I think tech is a great industry. It's definitely the industry that I want to be involved in. But I do think there are a lot of challenges in it. I think the biggest criticism that I have of the tech industry is it's very trend following and deep in biases. After Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook, and that obviously had a lot of success, all the venture capital people wanted nerdy white college kids who were programmers at Harvard or Stanford in order to build them the next great app that would make them billions of dollars. And then you look at the most successful startups that came out of it, It wasn't any of those people. It turned out it was Travis Kalanick, who's a serial entrepreneur who was over 40, or, Brian Chesky of Airbnb, who was a designer, and none of them were programmers. Even Snapchat, Evan Spiegel, who didn't have a technical background. Another example is people like to talk about in Silicon Valley about not sleeping. In order to start a company, you have to work really, really long hours. And because I guess Elon Musk did that when he started his company. But it turns out if you just look at any type of data on the issue, that's actually a horrible idea. Yes, you're working more hours, but your hours are less productive. And so I think there's a lot of institutional biases and sort of trend following that goes on in Silicon Valley that can sort of hold it back from its true potential. But ultimately, I think it's a great industry to be part of.
If you had to pick a space right now to start a company in, what would you start building?
Essentially, linear TV as we know it is transferring into internet on-demand television. I think that has a lot of impact in terms of how I think the average person spends like $60 a month on their cable bill. The question is, what are they going to do with that amount of money that they spend each month once they cut the cord? $10 of that may go to Netflix, but there's also another $30 worth of money that they're probably going to spend somewhere else. And so I think there's an opportunity there.
What do you think is going to happen to podcasts overall?
That's a good question. I think in a lot of ways, it's a similar disruption of radio. We used to hear a lot of like big radio personalities who were on, and I think we're going to see a lot of those personalities become more popular just from a podcasting standpoint. I think the question is, again, how do you monetize it? Well, there is advertising right here. It's kind of hard to track how many people listen to the ad or skip through it, or what was sort of the conversion rate. A lot of times the iTunes podcasting analytics is very early. So there's some challenges there, but I ultimately think it's going to be a very big industry and a very big space.
This is definitely where I'm going to put my ad for this episode.
yeah, throw it in right now.
This episode was brought to you by Relish.
Hi, I'm Zach.
Are we recording?
Yeah, Sarah, we're doing the ad right now.
Oh, hey, I'm Sarah.
And we are the co-founders here at Relish Careers.
We were once incoming MBAs, and we created Relish Careers because we wanted a way for MBAs and employers to connect online. So join relishcareers.com today to learn about the companies that want to hire you.
And to view our exclusive employer webinars this summer to prepare for school.
All right, Chris, let's do some rapid fire questions to end out this episode. Person, living or dead, that you'd love to get a drink with?
Brian Stevenson. He works at the Equal Justice Initiative. So one of the things I'm interested in outside my career is the mass incarceration problem in the United States. And I've seen his TED Talk and some of the interviews that he's given. I just find it so enlightening whenever I listen to anything from him. So I think it'd be really interesting to go to a talk one day or actually be able to meet him.
What was the first job you ever had, and what did you learn from that experience?
I worked at this market research firm in high school that essentially we would just sort of cold call people and ask them to take surveys for, I think, companies. I would call them up and ask them how many times they went to the gas station. And more than anything, I just realized that was a really tough job to do. You're just sitting in a room for 8 hours on calls, reading a survey over and over again to people who don't really want to answer the survey, and you're not really interested in the survey or what you have to say either. And you can never go off script.
Ooh.
That was the one way you could get fired, is if you went off script or if you tried to skip a step. I remember one of the worst parts is it would be like, how many times do you go to the gas station each week? And A, 0 times, B, 2 times, or C, more than 2 times. And someone would say, a couple of times. And I would have to say, the answers are A, 0 times, B, 2 times, C, more than 2 times. I said a couple of times, and it'd just be like, I can't take that as an answer. And then they just hang up. And it would be the worst thing ever. Yeah.
How is there not an answer for 1? How is 1 not an answer?
Yeah.
Last question for you, Chris. If you could go back a year, 2 years ago when you were first deciding that business school would be the right next step for you, what advice would you give yourself?
The biggest difference between me applying to business school and me applying to college is I had so much more resources and context as to what the game was in order to get into school. Different schools are looking for different types of essays, want you to hit on certain points that are unique to their culture. There's certain events you might want to attend, the importance of your test scores. So I guess the best advice is to get help on those things. I was lucky enough to join the MLT MBA prep program, which is something that you can apply to for minorities and people of color. But there's a lot of other resources out there for different groups, and there's consultancies out there and things like that. But I would definitely recommend taking advantage of those resources, because I think if you just sort of like go in and do your own thing, you're kind of at a huge disadvantage.
Awesome, man. Great stuff. If you start a company in a couple of years, let me know if you're hiring. I'm super proud of you for getting into the most selective business school in the world. Keep your head up, and I'm excited to see where you end up next summer and after you graduate.
Thanks, Adam. I'll talk to you soon.
Chris came from humble beginnings, but he had two major things happen in his life that got him to where he is today. First, his mom helped him apply to an Ivy League school, and then someone from that school named Jana introduced him to the world of tech. This is what led him to Google and ultimately to Twilio and now to the GSB. But the thing that was constant in Chris's story is that he learned to advocate for himself. He has the self-awareness to push when people told him he couldn't do something. Chris isn't afraid to send someone, including powerful executives, a message about why they should listen to him. The way I got my current pre-MBA internship this summer at Relish Careers, the sponsor of this episode of the podcast, was by emailing the CEO directly. She and the co-founder, Zach, both went to Darden, so I explained to them that I have an interest in marketing and technology and data analytics, and that I wanted to help them with their mission to help people like me find jobs after business school. If I wouldn't have shot them a note, or rather learned over the last decade that doing that sort of thing is mutually beneficial, then I wouldn't have worked there this summer, and I wouldn't have had someone to underwrite what it costs to produce an episode of the show. On the next episode of the MBA Candidate Podcast, I'll be joined by Gary McBerryhill. Gary is entering Tuck as a 36-year-old with a background in finance. He most recently was the CEO of his Native American tribe's private equity holding company. But Gary's story is not one I've encountered before. He grew up poor and lost both of his parents. He was gifted with a really high IQ, but suffered from depression, so he dropped out of college with a 3.8 GPA. His career didn't really start until he found himself in a call center at 28. That's already older than the typical MBA entering business school. Gary grew up Creek, in the middle of Oklahoma, and I hope you'll join me as we talk about race, altruism, and resiliency. I'm Adam Miller, and this is the MBA Candidate Podcast.